There are mirrors in this world that do not reflect, but remember. Books that do not echo truth, but rehearse distortions. Tonight, we do not turn the page of my chronicle. We open the other, the one that breathes ink backwards, the one that remembers lies until they become true. In the winter of 1832, a scholar named Thaddeus Greaves received a letter that would haunt his final days. The envelope arrived at his doorstep with no postmark, no courier, simply there one morning, as if it had materialized from the frost itself. The paper was thick, expensive, but carried an underlying scent of decay that made his stomach turn. The calligraphy was meticulous to the point of obsession, each letter formed with surgical precision, the ink so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The wax seal bore a sigil he'd never encountered, a quill split down the middle, its broken halves weeping crimson drops that had been pressed into the wax while still warm. When he broke the seal, his fingers came away stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The message inside was brief, urgent, and unsigned. I have found its twin. It breathes in the cellar below. You are known to the ink. Come before it remembers your name. Beneath these words, in fainter ink, was an address and a single word: hurry. Thaddeus Greaves had spent 37 years studying occult historiography, first as a junior curator at the prestigious Greywell Academy, then as an independent researcher after his dismissal. The Academy had grown uncomfortable with his theories about sentient texts, living manuscripts that could alter their own content. They called his work academically unsound and dangerously obsessive. But Thaddeus knew better. He had spent decades chasing whispered rumours of the Unholy Chronicle, a manuscript said to rewrite itself, to trap readers in its narratives, to consume memory itself. Most scholars dismissed such tales as folklore, medieval superstition dressed up in scholarly robes. Until now, Thaddeus had been among them. The letter changed everything. Someone else knew. Someone else had found proof. Within a fortnight, he was travelling through the frost-covered moorlands of Yorkshire, his breath forming clouds that lingered too long in the bitter air. The countryside grew increasingly desolate as he neared his destination. Farms abandoned, their windows dark and watching. The few locals he encountered at coaching inns spoke in hushed tones and avoided his eyes when he mentioned the Witherbridge Estate. "Used to be a proper manor," one innkeeper muttered, polishing the same glass over and over with shaking hands. "Belonged to the Ashworth family for generations. Then the son came back from his grand tour of Europe. Different. Started collecting books, they say. Strange books. After that?" The man shrugged, but his knuckles were white around the glass. Place went quiet. Too quiet. The final mile to Witherbridge was a nightmare of navigation. The path, barely visible beneath encroaching brambles, seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. Thorns caught at his coat with deliberate malice, tearing fabric and drawing blood. The trees, ancient oaks and elms, leaned inward at impossible angles, their bare branches intertwining overhead to form a tunnel of shadows. No birds sang, no wind stirred the leaves. The silence was absolute, oppressive, as if the very air had forgotten how to carry sound. When the Witherbridge Estate finally emerged from the gloom, Thaddeus felt his chest tighten with inexplicable dread. The structure was larger than he'd expected, built from dark stone that seemed to drink in what little daylight remained. Its windows glowed with a faint amber luminescence, though he could see no source of the light. No candles, no oil lamps, and certainly no fire in the chimneys, which stood cold and smokeless against the grey sky. The building itself seemed wrong. Not architecturally. The proportions were correct, the Gothic revival style perfectly executed. But it felt temporary, like a stage set that might collapse if examined too closely. The shadows fell at incorrect angles, and when he blinked, the windows seemed to shift their position slightly, as if the building were slowly breathing. The man who answered his knock was a ruin of human flesh, pale beyond albinism, with skin so translucent that blue veins mapped his skull like rivers of ink. His posture was that of someone who had spent years hunched over desks, spine curved into a permanent question mark. His fingers were stained black to the second knuckle, not with ordinary ink, but with something that seemed to move beneath his skin like liquid shadow. Most disturbing of all, he had no name. When Thaddeus introduced himself, the man simply nodded and gestured him inside, as if the concept of identity was foreign to him. The ink's memory has grown. Unpredictable, the man whispered, his voice carrying the rasp of disuse. Each word seemed to cause him physical pain, as if speaking were an act of rebellion against his nature. It remembers things that never happened, forgets things that did. Sometimes it remembers the future. The interior of Witherbridge Manor was a bibliophile's nightmare. Books lined every wall, filled every corner, stacked in precarious towers that reached toward the vaulted ceiling. But every spine was blank, not merely unlabelled, but actively empty, as if the titles had been surgically removed. The air reeked of ink and something else, something organic and rotten, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Most unsettling was the complete absence of mirrors or portraits. Where such things might naturally hang, there were only empty frames or bare patches of wallpaper, as if reflections themselves were too dangerous to permit. No reflections, the nameless man explained, following Thaddeus's gaze. They remember too much, show things that haven't been written yet. The man led him to what had once been a grand fireplace, its mantel carved with cherubs whose faces had been deliberately chiselled away. With surprising strength, he pushed against a section of the hearth, revealing a hidden passage. Behind it, an iron staircase spiralled downward into absolute darkness. They descended in complete silence, their footsteps echoing strangely, sometimes ahead of them, sometimes behind, as if time itself were confused. The air grew colder with each step, pressing against them with increasing weight until Thaddeus felt as though he were drowning in frigid syrup. His ears popped repeatedly, and he tasted copper on his tongue. The descent seemed to last hours, days. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but still they went down. Just when he thought he might collapse, they reached the bottom. The archive was no longer part of the house above. The walls were ancient stone, carved with wards and protective sigils that hurt to look at directly. Some of the symbols seemed to writhe when glimpsed peripherally, while others appeared to bleed actual blood that ran in thin rivulets between the stones. The air itself was wrong, too thick, too charged, crackling with potential energy that made his skin crawl. The room pulsed with cold, pale light that emanated from no visible source. At its centre stood a pedestal of black stone, its surface polished to mirror brightness. The stone was carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them, spelling out words in languages that predated human speech. Upon the pedestal lay a book. The binding was fashioned from something that had once been alive, not leather, but something softer, more yielding. It felt warm to the touch, and when Thaddeus looked closely, he could swear he saw tiny hairs growing from its surface. The cover was slick with iridescent ink that shimmered between deep burgundy and morning black, like dried blood under moonlight. The emblem on its cover was the Unholy Chronicle's sigil, but reversed, inverted, as if he were looking at its reflection in a tarnished mirror. "I have tried to close it," the nameless man said, his voice barely a whisper. "Locked it, bound it with chains, buried it, burned it." He held up his ink-stained hands, and Thaddeus saw that the stains weren't just on his fingers. They were under his skin, spreading up his arms like infection. "It opens anyway. Every morning it's open to a new page. Waiting." The man turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into silence, leaving Thaddeus alone with the breathing book. At first glance, the volume appeared identical to the legendary chronicle he'd studied for decades. The texture of the binding, the density of the ink, even the subtle scent of charred parchment, and something sweeter, like vanilla mixed with grave dirt. But as he opened it and began to read, a cold certainty settled in his chest. These stories were wrong. Fundamentally, horrifically wrong. The tales were familiar. He'd read variations of them in manuscripts across Europe, but they were inverted, perverted, as if someone had taken beloved fairy tales and drained them of every drop of hope or redemption. He read about the Black Hollow girl, but in this version, she did not survive the fire that consumed her village. Her screams were transcribed in twisted runes that seemed to echo from the page itself, and the chronicle offered no reprieve, no salvation. Instead, it described in loving detail how she continued to burn, how her agony fed the flames, how her dying breath formed the words that would summon the fire to the next village, and the next. The London calligrapher who had discovered cursed ink was equally transformed. Here his words did not merely change, they bled, literally bled from the pages and spread across the city like a plague, rewriting street signs into elegies, transforming love letters into suicide notes, causing deaths by the thousands. The chronicle described how his own tongue was torn from his mouth by his possessed pen, how he continued to write even as he drowned in his own blood, the cursed ink using his body as a vessel for its spreading madness. Most disturbing was the tale of the cartographer who had discovered the erased town. In the original chronicle, he eventually escaped, though forever changed. Here, he never left. He became the town's mayor, his memories rewritten weekly by whispers that came from the walls themselves. Each morning, he woke believing he had lived there all his life, his true identity buried deeper with each passing day. The chronicle described how he would find stones beneath his house, each carved with a different name, the ghosts of all his forgotten selves. The current stone, worn smooth by his fingers, read simply, "Here lies the map." Thaddeus turned the page with trembling hands and found a story he had never seen before. The Keeper Who Failed. The tale spoke of a man named Julian Ashworth, a scholar, a guardian, an obsessive collector who had been chosen by the Chronicle to serve as its keeper. But Julian had believed he could master the book, control its power. He had spent years devising glyphs of binding, seals of iron and silver, desperate to cage the Chronicle before its truths could undo the world. The Chronicle described Julian's hubris in exquisite detail, how he had carved protective wards into his own flesh, how he had built a ritual chamber beneath his manor, lined with blessed stones and holy water, how he had invited 13 scholars to witness his great work, the final binding of the Unholy Chronicle. But the Chronicle could not be bound. When Julian's seals shattered, when his wards failed, the book did not punish him with death. Death would have been mercy. Instead, it punished him with forgetting. Julian became a man without records, without lineage, erased from history even as he walked among the living. His writings dissolved from their pages, leaving blank parchment. His home collapsed inward, room by room, until only a shell remained. His family name vanished from stone and census, from birth records and marriage certificates. The 13 scholars who had witnessed his failure, they remembered him for exactly one day. Then they too forgot, their memories of him devoured by the hungry pages. Julian's body, the Chronicle explained, still wandered the moors. Still alive, still seeking to write his final chapter, but unable to remember what he was trying to say. Locals sometimes reported seeing a pale figure walking the frost-covered fields, carrying a quill that dripped black ink onto the ground. Where the drops fell, nothing would ever grow again. As Thaddeus read these words, he felt a growing horror that had nothing to do with the story itself. The margins of the page were darkening, new text appearing even as he watched, describing him, describing this moment. The scholar who doubted, the keeper who fed the ink by remembering, the one who brought the two together. He recoiled from the book, but the damage was done. New pages were materializing, filled with fragments of his own life. Dreams he'd had decades ago, written out in precise detail. Passages from essays he'd never published, thoughts he'd never shared. His mother's final words, whispered in delirium as she died of consumption. Lines from his childhood diary, supposedly destroyed in a house fire when he was 12. But most terrifying were the entries that described conversations he'd never had, places he'd never been, people he'd never met. A wife named Margaret, who had died in childbirth. A son named Thomas, who had grown up to become a priest. A career at Oxford that had ended in scandal when he was caught. Doing what? The ink was too blurred to read, but the shame was vivid and real. Were these false memories, or forgotten ones? Had the Chronicle stolen parts of his life, or was it showing him lives he might have lived? At the bottom of the page, written in his own careful handwriting, appeared a single line: "The next to be tested." Thaddeus slammed the book shut and fled the archive, his heart hammering against his ribs. He raced up the spiral staircase, taking the steps 3 at a time, the walls seeming to press closer with each turn. The sigils on the stones were glowing now, pulsing with malevolent light, and he could hear something following him, not footsteps, but the sound of pages turning, rustling like dry leaves in a wind that touched nothing else. When he finally reached the study above, gasping and wild-eyed, he found nothing. No manor, no books, no nameless host. The room had been replaced by ivy-choked ruins, the walls crumbled to waist height, the roof collapsed and open to the star-filled sky. Headstones jutted from the floor at irregular intervals, their inscriptions too weathered to read. The Witherbridge Estate had become a forgotten cemetery, and he was standing in what had once been its chapel. But in his arms, pressed against his chest, the book still pulsed with alien warmth. The journey home was a blur of coaching inns and changing horses, of suspicious glances from fellow travellers who seemed to smell something foul clinging to him. The book never left his side. He dared not let it out of his sight, but neither could he bring himself to open it again. It lay wrapped in his coat like a sleeping animal, occasionally stirring with what felt disturbingly like breath. When he finally reached his study in London, his sanctuary of 30 years, he discovered his worst fears realized. The original Chronicle, the one he had spent decades protecting, hidden behind false walls and sacred wards, sealed with blessed silver and iron, was gone. In its place sat the twin, silent now, closed, but different. The sigil on its cover had changed. It was no longer reversed, no longer the mirror image he had seen in the archive. Now it was identical to the one on the original Chronicle, the true Chronicle, the one that had vanished. A note lay beside it, written in his own careful handwriting, though he had no memory of writing it. There cannot be two keepers. Only one Chronicle may be remembered. The other must be forgotten, like all the lies it told. That night, Thaddeus lit every lamp in his study, every candle, every oil burner he could find. The room blazed with light, but somehow the shadows seemed deeper, more solid. He sat in his chair, staring at the silent book, waiting for it to stir. When it did not, when the clock struck midnight and still nothing happened, he felt a dangerous surge of hope. Perhaps the book was truly dormant. Perhaps he could study it, understand it, maybe even destroy it. He reached for his quill, the same one he'd used for decades, its ivory handle worn smooth by his fingers. He dipped it into the inkwell, the familiar ritual calming his nerves. He opened the Chronicle to a blank page and touched the nib to the parchment, and paused, for in the corner of the page, faint but unmistakable, he saw his own name written in his own hand, and below it, an erasure mark. As he watched, frozen in horror, more text began to appear. Thaddeus Greaves, born 1789. Died. When? The ink is still deciding. Keeper of the false Chronicle, keeper of the true Chronicle, keeper of nothing at all. He thought he was reading a story. He thought he was safe behind his lights and locks. He thought the book needed him. But every story needs an ending, and every keeper must eventually be kept. The last entry appeared in a different hand entirely, spidery, ancient, written in ink that seemed to move on the page. Welcome, brother. The archive below remembers you now. The stairs are waiting. Outside his study window, Thaddeus heard the sound of footsteps on cobblestone. Slow, deliberate, approaching his door. But when he rushed to look, the street was empty, save for a pale figure in the distance, walking away into the fog. The figure carried a quill that dripped black ink onto the ground. Where the drops fell, the cobblestones cracked and began to sink. A lie told often enough begins to echo like truth. Be wary of reflections too perfect, too eager to agree. For what looks like memory may be rehearsal for forgetting. Elias Nocturne, keeper of the true Chronicle. There is only one Chronicle. But ink spills where it will. A copy, a reflection, a rehearsal. Beware the pages that remember you before you read them. Beware the mirror that rewrites your name. If tonight's tale stirred something within you, a flicker of doubt, a forgotten name, then stay a while. There are more pages to turn. Subscribe for the next story, and share this Chronicle before it forgets you ever read it.